been to a grocery store lately, or any retail location, you'll have noticed that the stores are probably barer than they ever have been, or the shelves at least are barer than they ever have been. That's the case definitely where I am, and maybe the supply chain issues aren't as deep or as severe where you are, but you can tell that stores are having a hard time keeping their shelves stocked. And as a function of this, consumers, or American consumers, are switching brands more than they ever have. When we talk about brand switching, when we talk about customer loyalty, we then bring in a marketing perspective that I think is important to talk about. It's such an interesting time to be a marketer or anybody in charge of growth or getting a brand awareness, just getting your brand out there. Because there are so many factors at play that in good times, marketers or business leaders don't have to think about. So when the shelves are not as well stocked, then consumers are happier to switch to a different product to make sure that they have the things that they need. And this is definitely a concern when you have a brand that is more of a commodity, one that is easily substitutable. So that's the first thing that you probably have to think about is when you have a product out there in the world, how substitutable is it? Can somebody, for example, I make toastable waffles. Can that be easily switched out for something else? And the more ingrained or the wider your moat as a product, the less you have to worry about people switching out of your product, and the more sticky or the more loyal that you can make your shopper, your customer. The second thing I think that's interesting here, and it might not be completely driven by supply chain issues, all this brand switching, is that consumers, we talk about this a lot just in a general sense, but consumers are getting more educated about what goes into products, what products are, for example. There are research studies specifically in the healthcare field that looks at individuals or doctors who go into labor. And doctors who go into labor typically, I'll backtrack a little bit. So when you have a doctor that goes in for healthcare, typically they don't make the same decisions that an uninformed or maybe a standard patient would go in and make. And the canonical example is doctors in labor, where typically you have a standard patient or somebody who doesn't work in the medical field. You go in and I assume things get to a stage where there's a decision to be made around going from a natural birth to a C-section, and the uninformed consumer in that position will typically shift over faster to a C-section, which is a little bit more dangerous. I think there are greater risks of adverse effects later on, but they'll typically shift faster than a doctor going in who's having labor. And that's just a function of more knowledge. You'll see it as well when it comes to drug decisions, pharmaceutical drugs. Informed buyers, so doctors or pharmacists, typically don't go and buy the name brand drug. They'll go and buy the generic because they know that the trigger, the biological trigger, so the effect of the drug is the same. The same could be happening with standard products that we see at a grocery store. Consumers are getting more knowledgeable about what goes into these products, and maybe they're not willing in an inflationary environment to pay a premium for something that they know that that is functionally or in terms of ingredients the same. So yes, the shelves might be a little bit lower stocked, and it's harder to find the things that you absolutely want, but there could be an element here of price coming into this equation, to where, because consumers are a little bit more informed, there's more access to information just with our cell phone. When you're standing in an aisle, for example, that shift to something else is easier to make. That substitute is easier to purchase, and we're seeing then brand loyalty get a little bit more muddied. The last thing I wanted to bring up when in talking about this topic is that as marketers or as individuals who are in charge of growth for an organization, it's so important to not only be focused on your customer acquisition costs or your customer lifetime value, things that are top of mind as a marketer when it comes to bringing in customers, but to also be aware of what's happening logistically with your organization, what's happening in terms of the supply chain. Because if you think of these companies now that have poured millions and millions or just tons of resources into getting brand recognition and then their product onto a shelf, to have an individual shift out of your product because of a supply chain issue seems like a real waste of those resources up front. So as a marketer, it's important to understand where you need to lever up, lever down, toggle in alignment with supply chain. So if there's no point in driving demand for a product because you know that you can't meet the supply chain or the logistical demands of the product too. So then, there's a different equation there when it comes to investment and things like that. So as a marketer, it's easy to get lost in the weeds of bringing in customers, running ads, doing all these kinds of things. But it's also important to take a step back once in a while and say, okay, well, what is the consumer actually doing at the front line, at the retail point? And can we as an organization meet the demand of the consumer such that our marketing makes sense and then we can actually generate a return on our marketing? So, I thought that it was an interesting story in the Wall Street Journal, the idea that consumers are switching brands because of the shelves, because there are shortages, really all through any point of retail at this point. But I also thought it's important to think about the price implications. We're in a very inflationary environment right now. And with the ease of access to knowledge, is substitutability something that is factoring in here in terms of people just aren't willing to pay for the premium anymore for what they used to buy, so they'll switch into something else. Then also as a marketer, what are the implications of the supply chain issues, rising prices, brand loyalty issues in terms of your decision making when it comes to generating return on any of your marketing activities?